Chapter 8. In the tightly clustered suburbs just north of Los Angeles, the ProStar Plus turned away from any hope of the sea, and we followed. Soon Highway 101 became State Route 134, the widest river of concrete that I had yet seen, which offered passage through the metropolitan sprawl to stark and lonely mountains in the east. I was born in quiet Pico Mundo, where prairie surrendered to desert long before my time, and I lived there for more than 20 years. But the memory of my loss was too much with me in Pico Mundo. Although I knew that Stormy Llewellyn would not have hesitated to cross over to the other side, I woke many mornings with the hope that her lingering spirit would come to me, that I might see her again, and I went to bed at night to dream of the reunion that the day had not produced. When at last I ventured out into the world, seeking peace that I could no longer find in my hometown, I went only as far as St. Bartholomew's Abbey, on the California side of the Sierra Nevada, high in the mountains, where I stayed as a lay resident in the monk's guest house for half a year. My adventures since leaving the monastery had taken me to the town of Magic Beach, to a roadside enterprise called Harmony Corner, to a strange private estate in Montecito, but only now, for the first time in my life, into the outer precincts of a major city. Maybe I am by nature too lacking in sophistication to appreciate or adapt to life among teeming multitudes. The sight of one community after another flowing together without discernible borders, the vast valley and the serried hillsides encrusted with miles upon miles of houses and low-rise buildings, here and there clusters of high-rises. It oppressed me, and though we were traveling through it all at great speed, past exits for Burbank and Glendale and Eagle Rock, I felt enchained, claustrophobic. The volume of traffic increased by the minute. Afraid of losing our quarry, Mrs. Fisher wanted to close the gap between us and the truck. I insisted that we remain at such a distance that we could just barely see the 18-wheeler. You said he's all deceit, lies, and trickery, and that's true. But he's also, I don't know, intuitive, strangely intuitive. If we aren't extremely careful, he'll become aware of us. She glanced at me, her face that of a wizened pixie, but her eyes as analytic as the lasers of some facial recognition scanner that could read volumes of information, even in the blandest expression that I might turn upon her. And if we lose him, Audie, we'll find him again. How can you be so sure of that? Rather than meet that blue stare a moment longer, I shifted my gaze to the habitations of humanity that, in their plentitude, raised an inexplicable but nonetheless terrible foreboding in my heart. When I didn't reply to her question, she answered it for me. Maybe you're so sure of finding him again because you're strangely intuitive yourself. I didn't respond because her words were not just words, they were also bait. She had her secrets and I had mine, and for the time being, we would keep them to ourselves. The clear sky under which I had left Anna Maria back at the cottage remained clear here to the north of the city, but ominous palisades of dark clouds rose in the south and appeared to be falling toward us in a slow-motion avalanche. A wind had come out of the south as well, shuddering the trees. The high-soaring, graceful flocks of birds seen previously were gone, replaced by quick pairs and lone individuals that flew fast and low, darting as if from one temporary roost to another in search of the safest haven in which to ride out a coming storm. "What happened to your disguise?" Mrs. Fisher asked. "Disguise?" Oscar's lovely plaid cap. I don't know, I must have left it somewhere. I'm sorry. And the sunglasses? They broke when I almost said when the cowboy shot me in the throat, but caught myself. They just broke. She clucked her tongue, not good. Now there's just the chin beard and the choice of mustaches. I'm done with disguises, ma'am. They won't fool this guy. Across the wide highways, through the valley, over the tiered foothills, and up the rough slopes of the San Gabriel Mountains, vast, ragged shadows suddenly flew northward, although the clear sky revealed no cause for them. In all my troubled life, I had never seen anything like these swift shades, as if aircraft as large as football fields, and larger, passed low overhead in jet-speed squadrons. I almost exclaimed about them, but then I realized that Mrs. Fisher was unaware of the spectacle. She leaned forward over the steering wheel, squinting to keep the distant ProStar Plus in sight, among other 18-wheelers that might at any moment change lanes and screen her from it. Even if focused intently on the truck, she would have been aware of the racing shadows if she had been capable. Even if focused intently on the truck, she would have been aware of the racing shadows if she had been capable of seeing them. Evidently, they weren't real shadows, but perhaps were instead portents of some threat visible only to me. The many densely populated communities encircling us were more oppressive than ever, huddled, hive-like. In the stroboscopic flicker of light, the impossible shadows seemed not only to race over the landscape, but also to flail at it, and the buildings and all the artifacts of mankind appeared to twitch and shiver, much as the trees shuddered in the rising wind. For me, and for a moment, present and future became one, the latter floating on the former, sensed more than seen, presenting itself as feelings and metaphors rather than as a detailed vision of what was to come in the days and years ahead. Claustrophobia wound around me tighter and tighter, as if it were grave cloth and I were being mummified. For all that great cities had to offer, they were nonetheless mazes of streets. Mazes could thwart and trap. Broad, open freeways offered freedom only until clogged with traffic or barricaded. Any neighborhood, rich or poor, was potentially a ghetto. Every ghetto easily converted to a prison, every prison a potential death camp. To both sides of the highway, the residences and offices and retail outlets seemed at one moment to be burnt out and boarded up, but an instant later they appeared to be bunkers and battlements, arrayed not against a common enemy, but each against the other, in a war of all versus all. Now I felt the shadows that flailed the land as though they were accompanied by shock waves, and the flickers of sunlight were almost bright enough to blind. In addition to the broad freeway along which vehicles raced at high speed, I was also aware of these same concrete arteries in a state of sclerosis. Perhaps hours or weeks or years from now, commuters halted bumper to bumper. As insubstantial as figments of a dream, yet terrifying, an angry mob invaded my vague premonition, a faceless horde, bringing grim detail to the vision, metastasizing along the lanes of stalled cars and trucks, smashing windows, tearing open doors, dragging motorists and passengers onto the pavement, blades glinting, guns firing, boots stomping terrified faces. Blood. I might have lost consciousness for a few seconds, because when I opened my eyes, the landscape was no longer darkened by fast-moving and inexplicable shadows. The surrounding communities were neither in ruins nor fortified against conflict. Traffic sped along the freeway, and Mrs. Fisher sounded worried when she said, "Addie, what's wrong? Do you hear me? Addie?" Yes, ma'am, I hear you. The images from the premonition faded, but I still had a sense of being in the path of malevolent, implacable forces. That wasn't an unusual feeling for me, but this time the threat felt imminent. Are you alright? Mrs. Fisher asked. Sort of. Yeah, I'm fine. Just a little thing there for a moment. What's up? I think we've lost him. She drove as fast as ever, switching lanes with bravado, passing between a pair of 18-wheelers that bracketed us like cliffs, searching for the one that got away. There were suddenly so many trucks, and I thought I still had a lock on him, but then I realized it was a different rig. State Route 134 had become Interstate 210. The highway signs promised exits for Azusa and Covina. The dark clouds massed in the south were dramatically closer than before, and I suspected that I had been unconscious for minutes rather than seconds. Ma'am, you better get all the way over to the right. Take the next exit. Do you know where he's gone? How can you know where he's gone? I have a hunch. Working the car toward the right lane, Mrs. Fisher said, A hunch? A hunch isn't worth spit. Well, this one is, ma'am. It's worth spit and then some. Your hunches usually pay off, do they? I learned by going where I have to go, I said, determined not to explain psychic magnetism. She didn't slow down much for the exit ramp. I said left at the bottom. Because no traffic approached on the intersecting surface streets, she didn't obey the stop sign. Come to think of it, she said, how did you know he would be at that truck stop earlier? As we went through an underpass beneath the freeway, we politely pretended not to see the obscene spray-painted graffiti, which was colorful but, as usual, unimaginative. I suspect that those who see equal merit in graffiti and the work of Rembrandt might be wrong. I said trucker at a truck stop. It seemed logical. That's all it was, just logic. Yes, ma'am. You're dancing around the truth, child. You told me it was only all right to lie to evil. And you said you might be evil. Might be, I didn't say I was. Please turn left in 2 blocks, ma'am. Fact is, I'm not evil. The effect of the premonition had diminished enough to allow me to smile. First you said you might be evil, now you say you're not. I'd better tread carefully with you. We passed through a once prosperous retail area where a third of the businesses were gone, many of them restaurants, and the remaining shops and services had a tattered look that suggested they were week-to-week enterprises. Some days lately it seemed that everything was a week-to-week enterprise, including the country and the world. A traffic signal turned green to accommodate us, and I said, after the intersection, pull to the curb. Mrs. Fisher braked to a stop in front of a thrift shop operated by the Salvation Army. I said, I'll be going the rest of the way alone, on foot. Is that really wise? I'm not sure anything I do is wise, ma'am, but I've stayed alive a lot longer than I ever expected. What do you want me to do? I'm grateful that you came along, and I'm thankful for your help, but I don't want you to be hurt because of me. You need to get on with your life while I get on with trying to understand mine. After her many years of living, perhaps even from her childhood, Mrs. Fisher's eyes were the sky reflected in the sea, eternity mirrored in the everlasting waters. Even if she had not given voice to the next thing that she said, meeting her gaze, I would have known that the secrets to which she often alluded were real and profound, and no less strange than my own. She said, something big is coming, Adi. Something so very big that the world will change. I know you feel it too. Yes, ma'am. How long have you felt it? Almost all my life, but more so lately. Much more so lately, she agreed. Child, do you know where truly great courage comes from? The kind of courage that will never back down? I said, faith. And love, she said. Faith is a kind of love, you know, love of what is unseen but certain. Love makes us strong and brave. I thought of Stormy and how the loss of her had tempered my steel. Yes. Heath and I never had children. I believe that I wasn't given any children because I needed to save all that love for a time late in my life when I would need it to give me courage. Suddenly the rising wind rose faster, buffeted the limousine, and conjured a dust devil full of leaves and litter that whirled up from the gutter and followed a drunkard's path down the center of the street. She said, you see, many years ago, 3 times I had the same vivid dream about a motherless, fatherless boy who was nevertheless not an orphan. Are you without a mother and father, Audie? They're still alive, ma'am, but they were never a mother and father to me. I've been on my own since I was 16. When I saw you standing beside the coast highway, I recognized you from the dream, though you are not a boy any longer. Several pages of a newspaper flocked along the street, faux birds of ill omen, flapping ungainly wings of words. What's the story of your dream? I asked. What happens in it? A true and lovely thing, that's all I'll say for now, but I will never, as you suggest, get on with my life by leaving you here and driving away. If you must go by foot now and alone, so be it, but I'll get on with my life by waiting right here until you come back. I wish you wouldn't. She opened her voluminous purse. Take the gun. I thought of the premonition, universal war, all against all. If such a conflict was coming, it wouldn't happen in the next day or the next week. Probably not even in the next year. Maybe it would never happen. The future isn't set. Our free will creates our future. Mrs. Fisher plucked the weapon from her purse and pressed it into my hands. Take, I've got others. As I tucked the pistol in my waistband and under my sweatshirt, I said, you seem to be prepared for anything. We all better be prepared, child. Her eyes remained solemn, even when she smiled. She reached out and gently pinched my cheek. Be safe, Audie. Come home. Chapter 9. When I got out of the limousine, the wind tossed my hair and threw dust in my eyes, as if it were a malicious spirit. The day was chilly for Southern California in early March, especially considering that the storm front had come in from the southwest. The sea, which this gruff wind would have bullied into whitecaps, must have been unusually cold. I could faintly smell the distant shore, mostly the astringent scent of iodine given off by certain seaweeds when they are tossed onto the beach to decompose above the tide line. I walked past the thrift shop to the nearby corner and turned left. The 2- and 3-story buildings were old, mostly of painted brick with cast stone Art Deco details in their parapeted roofs and pedimented windows. Phoenix palms lined the street, more stately than the neighborhood in which they flourished. Instead of consciously choosing a route, I went where psychic magnetism drew me, never sure when I might find myself before a door and know that my quarry waited beyond it, or around a corner and come face to face with him, or hear the word dirtbag spoken behind me and turn to discover that my talent for attraction had drawn him to me instead of me to him, his silencer-equipped Sig Sauer in my face or crotch. Ahead of me, from high in a wind-tossed phoenix palm, 4 rats that were remarkably fat for these lean times descended from their fair-weather nest in the thick dry skirt just below the glorious spray of green fronds. Like a precision drill team, they came one behind the other, nose to tail, legs synchronized. At the bottom of the tree, the quartet spilled over the curb into the gutter and disappeared through the bars of a drainage grate, as disciplined as any human family in the vast, flat Midwest when the tornado sirens wailed and the house had to be abandoned for the storm cellar in the backyard. Although I know the world is an intricately more complex place than it appears to most people, although I understand in my blood and bones that humanity is a turbulent family aboard an endless train on an infinite journey to shores that can only dimly be imagined by the living, I don't see signs and portents everywhere I look. Most often, a haloed moon means nothing more than that reflective volcanic ash has made its way into the stratosphere, and a 2-headed goat is only a genetic curiosity. The mommy porn genre currently sweeping the book industry, and the Babylonian excess of most television shows probably fall within the historical norm in our culture's sleaze index and are not omens of the imminent collapse of civilization. Though if I were not so busy, I might start building an ark. Those 4 brown rats, however, descending at precisely that moment instead of any other, impressed me as being more than merely rodents on the run from threatening weather. For one thing, at the curb, before slinking into the gutter, each turned its head toward me, its whiteless eyes as glossy as black glass, its scaly tail lashing back and forth twice before it continued out of sight into the drain. I found myself drawn to the curb where I stood staring at the large rectangular grate, shivering with recognition. It was made in an age when public works were elegant and well-crafted instead of slipshod. The parallel iron bars met a 4-inch iron ring in the center of the design. Within the ring, a stylized iron lightning bolt angled from right to left. On a fog-bound night in Magic Beach more than a month previously, on a street deserted but for me, I had been drawn to such a greeting, below which grotesque shadows capered in pulses of eerie light. On that occasion, in the grip of curiosity, I had knelt to peer between the bars into the culvert, seeking an explanation for this unusual display. I had been by some means induced into a half-trance, so that I lowered my face ever closer to the drain, overcome not only by a compulsion to learn what might lie below, but also by the intense expectation that whatever it proved to be, I needed it as surely as I needed air and water and food to sustain life. The sudden arrival of an unexpected ally on that lonely street in Magic Beach had broken the spell and had brought me to my feet. Later, I felt that I had been close to discovering something that might have been the end of me. Not merely death, but a more terrible and enduring end. Now, I did not follow the rats to the grate, but turned away and walked swiftly, not quite running. I went 4 blocks, the battalions of incoming storm clouds forgotten, oblivious of the wind, the rats banished from my mind. Rather, I succumbed to one of those fugues that sometimes strike us when, below the age of 10, we chance upon a truth meant only for adults, a sharp truth that stabs darkness into the light of innocence, that makes us at once rebel against this assault on wonder, that sends us away to games and bicycles and all manner of distractions, from which we rise in a few hours like a sleeper from a dream, having spun a cocoon of denial to protect us from that piercing truth, although it is a fragile cocoon that in time will dissolve. Halting at a street corner, looking back the way I had come, I had no memory of the buildings I had passed, only of the lightning bolt grate that lay 4 blocks to the south. For that distance, I'd even forgotten why I'd come here. Now I remembered the rhinestone cowboy, his spiky white hair, his pitiless stare, his vacation in Helltan. My heart lagged my brain, beating hard and fast as if I were still within a step of the ominous drain grating. Giving it time to settle into a rhythm less suggestive of a crisis in an ER, I studied my surroundings. I had arrived in a district of old industrial buildings, mostly constructed of dark red or pale yellow brick with slate or tile or corrugated metal roofs, others of stucco, cracked and stigmatized with stains of such disturbing shapes that they might have depicted Armageddon reflected in a funhouse mirror. Some structures appeared still to be in use. Others were untenanted or abandoned, diminished by missing window panes, months of debris compacted by wind and rain in their doorways, and weeds bristling from cracks in the pavement of the adjacent parking yards around which chain-link fencing sagged. As the last blue sky shrank northward, thunderheads towered as if they were mountains thrusting violently from the Earth's crust in a fierce seismic and volcanic age, millions of years before any living thing yet crawled the planet. I walked south into the wind, retracing my route for a block and a half, noticing that other street drains lacked the lightning bolt, until I arrived at the mouth of a wide alleyway, similarly lined with industrial buildings and warehouses. In some other pockets of this neighborhood, workers labored, deliveries were being made, and shipments loaded. But here, in spite of wind-stirred power company lines that softly whistled overhead, there lay a stillness more suited to a ghost town than to any place in a living city. As I entered the alley, the sun abruptly submerged in clouds, and the bleak black shadows of utility poles melted into the potholed pavement. On both sides were elevated loading docks, man-sized doors, big roll-ups, and latticed windows of many small panes so filthy that they were all but opaque. Past the middle of the block, I was drawn to a building narrower than the others, with a man door and 3 roll-ups large enough to admit trucks of any size. The windows were as blinded with dust as all the others, but lights inside lent the glass a silvery sheen. Beyond doubt, the cowboy trucker was nearby. The image of him in my mind's eye grew brighter and more colorful, and so fearsome that, to prevent him from fulfilling his threat, I wished fervently that I had bought a Kevlar jockstrap. At the man-sized door, I stood with my head cocked, listening. When I heard nothing, I drew the pistol from my waistband. I tried the lever handle, and the unlocked door opened a crack. Emboldened by the enduring silence, I eased inside and closed the door quietly behind me. I stood in a brick-walled garage brightened by overhead banks of fluorescent tubes. Only the middle of the 3 bays contained a vehicle, a white Ford van, one of those small delivery vans used by florists and caterers, although this one had no company name or logo emblazoned on it. When I opened the van, the cargo area contained nothing, though perhaps soon it would imprison 3 bound, gagged, and terrified children meant for burning. For the sake of silence, I left the vehicle open. In the back wall of the garage, opposite the roll-ups, 2 doors flanked a freight elevator. There is a classic short story in which a man must open one of 2 doors, aware that a beautiful lady waits behind one and a hungry tiger behind the other, but he doesn't know which door is which. Given my luck, I expected to find tigers to the left and right. The freight route didn't appeal either. Compelled to the door on the right, I found ascending stairs. They were concrete with glued-on rubber treads for safety, which also served to mute my footsteps. I eased the door shut behind me. I had climbed halfway to the first landing when I heard two male voices above me in the stairwell. The words bounced between the brick wall on my right and the easy, clean, glossy yellow fiberboard on my left, and were distorted so that I couldn't be certain that either speaker was the cowboy trucker. With the pistol, I could intimidate them, but if my quarry was not one of the two, I would have no way of knowing whether or not I might be threatening innocent men. I hurriedly descended the stairs, entered the garage, and found it changed. Instead of overhead fluorescents, 3 single-bulb lamps with cone-shaped shades hung on chains. The poor light shone just bright enough for me to see that the brick walls were gone and that bare concrete replaced them. More startling than any of that was the red and black ProStar Plus, with sparkly silver striping in its long black trailer, which stood in the center bay where the white van had been only seconds earlier. In this enclosed space, the 18-wheeler looked even bigger than it had appeared to be on the open road. And although an inanimate object of any size, lacking consciousness and intention, cannot be malevolent, this truck seemed as malign as the Death Star with which Darth Vader atomized entire planets. Chapter 10. The ProStar Plus stood in the transform garage as though it had eaten the Ford van. I wondered if I should reconsider my disdain for possessed vehicle movies like The Car, Maximum Overdrive, and The Love Bug. After a life of supernatural engagement, I was not paralyzed by this seeming impossibility. I scurried around the 18-wheeler to the side farther from the door that I left open behind me, sheltering there until I could get a glimpse, at an angle through the driver's window and the windshield, of who followed me out of the stairwell. If one of them was the Rhinestone Cowboy, I might still get the drop on him. If that proved to be impossible, if, say, he appeared with the flamethrower that he intended to use on the children, I could retreat through the outer door by which I'd entered the building and hide elsewhere along the alley, at a position from which I could monitor events. No one came out of the stairwell, but I heard 2 men talking. They seemed to be nearby, yet their voices were veiled. The words were distorted beyond understanding, as when the cowboy and the man with the battered boxer face, semi-transparent and unaware of me, had been in urgent, angry conversation in the basement machine room at the truck stop. This time they did not appear even in phantom form. I had only their voices, by which I could not precisely place them, and then they fell silent. I was concerned that they had become aware of me as I had been aware of them in the machine room. Perhaps our circumstances had been reversed, and I was semi-transparent to them, while they were invisible to me. The next 20 or 30 seconds were as sharp as saw teeth, working on my taut wire nerves, as I waited to feel the singular chill of one of these men passing through the space that I occupied. Instead, I heard an engine turn over. Not that of the ProStar Plus, but that of a much smaller truck, though it was muffled and hollow, filtered through some barrier, just as the voices had been filtered. I could only assume that it was the white Ford van, which had become invisible to me. A moment later, a rattling and low rumbling perplexed me for a moment, but then I realized that this was the distorted sound of a big, segmented door rolling on its tracks. I turned toward the alleyway, but none of the 3 roll-ups was in motion, all snug down tight. I listened to the unseen van reverse away from me, out of the garage. Following its departure came the rumble of the huge segmented door descending, although the door behind the ProStar Plus and the two flanking it were already down and locked. In high school, the spirit world frequently distracted me from science studies, and my interest in higher mathematics was no greater than my interest in self-immolation, but I scored well in English. I possessed the ability and the skills to write about the coexistent garages, but I sadly lacked the knowledge to intelligently express a theory explaining how such a thing could be, or, for that matter, why fire makes water boil. If two garages existed in the same place in different worlds or dimensions or whatever, I seemed to be, for the moment, in the world/dimension/whatever that was different from mine. And the two men whose voices I heard had evidently driven the Ford van away into the world from which I had come. In Shower 5 at Star Truck, in the basement machine room of that same facility, and now in the garage of this industrial building, two realities crossed. Shower 5 elsewhere had not been a shower room at all, but a barren place, just as basement machine room elsewhere had been devoid of machinery, and this garage in elsewhere was likewise a stark concrete box. I had been shot to death in the elsewhere shower, but remained alive in the real Shower 5. Now, the Rhinestone Cowboy parked his truck in elsewhere, and, with some associate, drove away into my reality, perhaps fearing that authorities were looking for the ProStar Plus because he had run me off the road with it, or for a reason I couldn't fathom. This guy was able to do things that people failed to see, like shoot an innocent cantaloupe to bits, and he could step out of reality into elsewhere when it suited him. My skull hurt. My brain felt abused. I needed a plate of my own uber fluffy pancakes to restore my full cognitive function. The cowboy might have as many paranormal talents as I possessed, or even more, maybe. Except, well, it seemed to me that anyone with such astonishing abilities would not dress so ridiculously. Not that I'm saying that every superhumanly gifted person ought to wear jeans and sweatshirts or t-shirts as I do, or all Ralph Lauren, but boots of carved leather with fancy snakeskin inlays, a black sports coat with red lapels and collar crusted with sequins, as if he was a Grand Ole Opry wannabe, the Joker, Bane, Lex Luthor, the Green Goblin. They all had better taste in clothing than this guy. Besides, in the real world, as opposed to the worlds of comic books, a guy with paranormal powers would not want to draw attention to himself. Trust me. Alone with the 18-wheeler, I decided to check it out. He had left a set of keys in the ignition, evidently certain that there were no thieves in elsewhere. The driver's compartment contained nothing of interest other than the string of red beads and little carved bone skulls which hung from the overhead CB radio. On closer inspection than I had been able to do previously, I found that the long vertical latch bolts on the back of the trailer were secured by custom shackles. One of the keys released them. When I opened the tall doors, a row of LED bulbs brightened along the center of the trailer ceiling, front to back. Immediately inside the doors, a 2-panel stainless steel gate blocked entrance. Into a series of vertical 1-inch bars, a talented metalworker had incorporated 3 pentagrams, a Celtic cross, a Maltese cross, a Latin cross, in ink, 2 swastikas, and perhaps a dozen symbols that I couldn't name. Work by an artisan this masterful, Not a weld showing, the steel regrained after construction, the dazzling design harmonious in spite of its disparate elements, would have cost many thousands of dollars. Beyond the gate, the 3 walls, the floor, and the ceiling of the trailer were painted with the same symbols, sun-yellow forms on a black background. The lighting revealed no cargo. In fact, it looked like a trailer that never carried freight, and if that should be the case, I wondered what purpose it served for the cowboy. Evidently, he wasn't a true trucker after all, just a man who drove a truck. He must earn his living in some other way, though I doubted that, even in this transgressive age, anyone could sustain a paying career as a burner of defenseless children. Although no lock was apparent, the halves of this gate were firmly secured to each other. I could neither pull nor push them apart. Only as I began to close the doors did I suspect the trailer might not be as vacant as it appeared. Through the steel filigree issued a disturbing scent, as sweet as incense, and yet suggestive of decomposition, like nothing I'd ever smelled before. Perhaps it was an odor lingering from a previous cargo, but I had not detected it initially. With the malodor came a sudden chill, not internal to me, less than a draft, a mere breath, an icy effluence that, like spicules of sleet, prickled my face. Convinced that whatever the cowboy hauled, he didn't merely deal in loads of consumer electronics or goods for the pottery barn, I closed the trailer doors, shot the long bolts, engaged the shackles. Although I can't explain why, following exposure to the stink and the chill, I wanted to spend a couple of hours in a bathtub filled with Purell sanitizing gel. Maybe take a few turns being eradicated on the carousel of a human-sized microwave oven. Spend an hour inhaling steam made with water from the shrine at Lourdes, and have my blood drained from my left arm, processed through a state-of-the-art filtration machine, and returned into my right arm free of all contaminants. Afterward, a lollipop would be nice. I found myself backing away from the trailer and realized that my skittish heart was cantering again, as it had been when I'd seen the drainage grate with the lightning bolt. Suddenly, the black and red 18-wheeler with its sparkly silver striping seemed as if it might be some kind of carnival truck, which had unpleasant associations for me. I know that most carnival folks are nothing like their public image. The majority are good people who just don't fit in anywhere else, and they have a complex, charming social structure of their own. I read this book, Twilight Eyes, all about them, but I once had a bad experience with 2 carnies. This guy named Pecker, I don't think it was his baptismal name, operated a ring-toss concession. His woolly hair was teased precisely as high as the long beard that it says depended from his chin, but it probably should say descended. So he almost looked like Siamese twins joined at the tops of their heads. He and his joyfully wicked friend Bucket, the owner-operator of cotton candy and snow cone machines, had hoped to establish an after-hours carnival concession at 3 o'clock one summer morning, in which I would be gagged and lashed to a tree to serve as the target. The 2 of them intended to take turns throwing hatchets at me. I had done something that annoyed them. Fortunately, I am quick on my feet, tougher than I look, parentheses, which I would have to be, close parentheses. And I was in the company of a friendly poltergeist that left them bewildered by beating them senseless with 100 baseballs from the milk bottle pyramid concession. Anyway, having at last gotten the peek into the trailer that I long had wanted, reasonably sure that my quarry had driven away in the white Ford van, I decided to leave this garage and elsewhere. I intended to depart through the door by which I had entered, expecting that I would step back into my world as magically as I had previously stepped out of it. Approaching that exit, however, I noticed for the first time that the only light came from the 3 overhead bulbs dangling in cone-shaped shades, none whatsoever from the 3-foot-high bank of lattice windows above the main door and the 3 roll-ups. Only perfect blackness lay beyond those panes. I had arrived in the early afternoon, and no more than 5 minutes had passed since then. The coming storm couldn't have seethed in so quickly. Even if threatening clouds lowered over the city from horizon to horizon, no storm could have banished every last trace of sunlight. At the door I paused, pistol in my right hand, left hand on the lever handle. I sensed that opening this door would be as stupid as seeking the source of gas fumes in a dark basement by striking a match. Intuition is the highest form of knowledge. What we learn from others can be mistaught by those not a fraction as knowledgeable as they pretend to be, or by those who are propagandists with agendas. We are born with intuition, however, which includes the natural law, a sense of right and wrong. A lot of people rebel so continually against natural law that not only does that part of their intuition atrophy, but also every other aspect of it. They strike the match, open the door, give their money to an investment advisor named Slick, and trust that if they are really nice to the thug with a switchblade, he'll be nice to them. Whatever waited outside this garage and elsewhere would not be as easy to deal with as a psychopath with a knife. I backed away from the door, glanced again at the high windows, wishing that the darkness would give way to the murky light of an overcast sky. This is as effective as wishing for world peace. To look through those windows into the alleyway, I would have to climb to the top of the trailer, an easy enough feat, but the odor and the chill that had passed through the ornamental gate were fresh in memory, and I was possessed by the perhaps irrational fear that a trap in the trailer roof would open under my feet and drop me into a kind of trouble that I had never known before. In need of a room with a view, I returned to the open stairwell door to listen. The quiet was profound, a stillness as in a vacuum. If anyone waited on the upper floor, he must be dead or death. Previously, the wall on the left had been paneled in easy-to-clean yellow fiberboard, and the wall on the right had been brick. Now, they were both concrete. On the steps, the glued-on rubber treads were missing. The first time I entered the stairwell, before hastily retreating at the sound of voices, it had been in my world. Now it was in some parallel reality. Some days I wonder about my sanity. A good cheeseburger usually restores my confidence. If that doesn't work, I watch an episode of some reality TV show like The Real Housewives of Wherever, and by comparison with the stars of the program, I feel as solid as the blacksmith's anvil. The stairwell seemed unnaturally clean. In the becalmed air and the cold light, no dust motes drifted in suspension. Not one tattered strand of spider silk waited for a draft to flutter. No desiccated flies or shriveled moths or a single scrap of lint littered the stairs. No cracks or water stains marred the surrounding concrete. Stepping across the threshold onto the bottom landing, I felt that I must be somewhere outside of time, the only living creature in a place to which even the spirits of the lingering dead never ventured. Warily, I climbed the stairs. Chapter 11. Halfway toward the mid-floor landing, I was overcome once more by the perception that these concrete walls were not concrete at all, but were instead the idea of concrete. A thought that first occurred to me back at Star Trek when Shower 5 in the real world abruptly became Shower 5 elsewhere. I didn't know what I meant by that, but my suspicion was evoked by the continuity of color and texture. An unvarying gray without the smallest stain, without a single line or trace of wood grain from the lumber forms into which the concrete would have been poured, no surface voids or exposed aggregate. When I slid my left hand along the inner wall, the surface felt at first like concrete, but then like fiberboard with a high gloss finish, although to my lying eyes it remained curiously perfect concrete. When I put my right hand to the outer wall, my questing fingers slid across bricks and recessed mortar joints that I could not see, although a moment later the texture of a smooth concrete surface returned. I didn't know what to make of all this, except that my reality and elsewhere seemed to occupy the same space at the same time. In elsewhere, my world floated just below the surface of things, and in my world, elsewhere was submerged and waiting. Whether this was true everywhere that I might go, or only in some locations, I could not know for sure, but I suspected that the two realities intersected only rarely, as in some rooms of Star Trek, and in this abandoned industrial building. Wherever and whatever elsewhere might be, I didn't think that it was a world like ours, that it was either peopled by different versions of ourselves, or by another race entirely. The cowboy trucker had parked his rig here, leaving the keys in the ignition because he knew that in elsewhere it would remain undiscovered and safe, which suggested that elsewhere was a dead zone of sorts, populated neither by anyone nor anything. The mid-floor landing had no windows. I paused to listen, but heard nothing other than my stomach grumbling about not yet having received the cheese meatloaf, steak fries, and coleslaw that I had all but sworn an oath to consume back at the truck stop. I continued upward, and at the top of the second flight, I came to a landing door on my right, with more stains on my left leading to the third floor. More stairs on my left leading to the third floor. I didn't need to seek the highest vantage point, and a second floor window would satisfy my curiosity about the untimely darkness that seemed to lie beyond these walls. In my world, this building was perhaps 80 years old, dirty and battered, and unoccupied if not even abandoned. It had not in any recent decade been refurbished. Judging by the design and the details of its construction, the metal door on the landing was as old as the building. It should have been scratched and dimpled, as no doubt it was in my reality, though here it appeared to be as unmarked as it was on the day it had been installed. The immaculate condition of the door seemed not just improbable, but impossible. And when I concentrated closely and entirely upon it, searching its smooth surface for a sign of wear, I was more than half persuaded that it was merely the drawn image of a door, like that in a clever Trompe-l'oeil L''OEIL painting, or on the backdrop of a cunningly designed stage setting, convincing not because of elaborate detail, but because the artist's use of perspective and light was masterful. Nevertheless, the knob felt solid in my grasp, and it turned without resistance. The knuckles of the barrel hinges revolved soundlessly around the pivot pins, and the door opened as smoothly as one liquid flowing into another, so that I could almost believe that I was adventuring in my sleep. Beyond lay a hallway. The ceiling, walls, and floor were as uniformly gray and smooth as in the garage and stairwell. Overhead hung the usual crude lamps. When I stared hard at the nearest one, it produced less light, not because the bulb dimmed, but because the bulb, the shade, and the chain all seemed to diminish in substance when studied intently, as if sufficient scrutiny might in time cause them to disappear altogether. I didn't test that hypothesis because I didn't want to be left whimpering in the dark. On both sides of the corridor were a few doors like the one through which I had just come. America's primary institution of learning, the movies, has taught us that when we find ourselves in a strange and eerily quiet place, my phone just opened up another website, and so I'm trying to find where I was at. Chapter 11, I think. The movies has taught us that when we find ourselves in a strange and eerily quiet place with lots of doors, waiting behind one of them will be either a psychopathic killer or a monster of supernatural or extraterrestrial origin. Of course, if it's an Adam Sandler comedy, behind the door will lurk a goofy dude waiting to deliver a joke involving poop, pee, or genitals. I wasn't in such a comedy, but that was alright because I preferred a psychopath or a monster. When I opened the nearest door on the right, nothing bit off my hand. A single lamp hung in the center of the unfurnished gray room. I crossed to the windows and was stunned to see the sprawling suburbs of the valley cast in darkness. Not one street lamp or building light to be seen. Far beyond the Hollywood Hills to the southeast, no faintest glow rose from the flatlands of Los Angeles and environs, though on an ordinary night the incandescence of civilization would shimmer in the air and paint the bellies of the clouds a burnt butter yellow. Above the black land, the blacker sky had been swept clean of moon and stars. In the middle distance, 3 widely separated lakes of low flames glimmered and twinkled red-orange-blue, like the baleful campfires of savage and malevolent settlements. They burned without illuminating their surroundings, as if the night air had a natural weight sufficient to prevent the light from rising. Although the uncanny gloom flooded the land before, between, and beyond the pooling fires, the realm on the farther side of the windows was not blind dark. I was able to discern that the street in front of this building had vanished, replaced by barren ground. And suddenly I knew that the suburbs and the city they encircled had not merely gone dark in a power outage, but had ceased to exist either as intact structures or as ruins. In my reality, this building stood in an industrial neighborhood, but in elsewhere it seemed to loom alone above a blackened wasteland. I had wanted a window with the view. Now I wanted a quiet corner in which I could curl up in a ball and suck my thumb until my fairy godmother came and took me away from this hostile, empty world. In this blighted kingdom, however, wishes were answered in such a perverse way that they were far better left unwished. 20 feet below, where the street should have been, something moved, a vertical shadow, and the other was still in amorphous dark. Squinting, I saw what might have been a man, but he was so little differentiated from the murk around him that I couldn't make out his face or determine what he wore. One thing about him was certain: he didn't have fairy wings. If the weak light in the room around me filtered through the glass, none of it reached as far as the figure below, although it revealed me to him. He halted. I sensed him looking up, but I did not draw back from the window. I had already been seen. He would come to me or he wouldn't. After a moment, he approached the front of the building, disappearing into the recessed entrance. Pistol in hand, I returned to the second-floor hall. Moments before, I had climbed the west stairs, which originated at the garage and back. The door at the east end of the hallway suggested another stairwell, rising from the front of the building, which was probably the one by which he would come to me. My keen intuition, which had often been my salvation, was largely a mental faculty, its physical expression limited to an occasional tingle at the nape of the neck, the hairs bristling on the backs of my hands, and, unseemly but true, a certain tightening of the scrotum, although that last reaction was about as erotic as a spinal tap. In this instance, a swift series of chills quivered violently through me, as if I were constructed entirely of taut harpstrings that thrummed with glissandos of foreboding. At all costs, I needed to avoid a confrontation with that shadowy figure. I didn't know why. I must keep my distance from the man, if man he was, and I had no one to ask, because intuition is a one-way communication from God, who never seems inclined to satisfy our curiosity. Perhaps because, given the chance, every one of us would be like a child on a family road trip, endlessly asking, "Are we there yet?" or the equivalent. I turned away from the east end of the corridor and hurried to the west stairs, by which I had come up from the garage. Going down again seemed foolhardy, in part because leaving the building wasn't an option. If I ventured outside into unknown conditions, I might find it difficult, if not impossible, to get back inside. I assumed that I would have to be within the envelope of the building to be able to return to my reality when the shift occurred again, which might be hours or mere minutes from now. After bolting up 2 flights to the top of the stairs, I pulled on the door, which swung open as silently as those before it, as if its lever handle, latch, and hinges operated with zero friction. For a long moment I stood on the landing, listening. When the stairwell door opened on the second floor, I didn't hear a sound. No sudden draft alerted me. I knew the visitor from the wasteland had entered the stairs only when his shadow preceded him, flowing onto the mid-floor landing below in such a sinuous fashion as to suggest that the man yet unseen would prove to be in part a serpent. I slipped into the hallway and eased the door shut, although left to gravity it would most likely have closed without a click. The third floor seemed identical to the second. I doubted that I had time to race all the way to the east stairs before my pursuer would arrive and see me. Besides, switching stairwells for hours on end was not a strategy, hardly even worthy of the word tactic. That gambit was certain to result sooner or later in the two of us coming face to face in a doorway, which might not end well for me even though I had a pistol. In my experience, sometimes the guy on the other side of the door possessed something more formidable than a handgun, such as a submachine gun or an automatic shotgun, or an enraged ferret that he threw in my face. Or he was clothed head to toe in body armor and held a surface-to-air missile that, if fired horizontally, could reduce you to a pile of flaming entrails. Or he was wearing a 9-sheath spring-loaded antique Chinese automatic knife breastplate, which in a split second could skewer you with enough stilettos to kill you, and, should you have one, your cat as well. Trusting to luck, such as it was, I hurried halfway along the corridor and chose a door to my left. Beyond, a dimly lighted flight of stairs led up to another door. I was pretty sure the building featured no more than 3 stories. Maybe these stairs went to an attic. I don't like attics any more than I like cellars. Most people have never found anything in an attic more off-putting than silverfish, dry rot, and faded high school photographs that remind them of how much promise they once had and of how little it has been fulfilled. In my case, however, I tend to find things like a collection of shrunken heads hanging by their hair from the rafters, or a fighting falcon trained to swoop down and pluck out an intruder's eyes, or a tripwire-activated capture net that drops over any unwanted visitor and cinches ever tighter around him until he's immobilized. In spite of my experiences of attics, looking back the way I had come, when I saw the door begin to open at the west end of the hallway, I stepped across the threshold onto the landing. I drew the door shut behind me. Once I was on the roof, I would be outside of the building's envelope with nowhere to run, and with more than a 40-foot drop to the ground below. Nevertheless, I hastily climbed this last flight of stairs because, for one thing, when confronted with the unknown, of which this man from the wasteland was an embodiment, it was never wise to be confrontational, and because rational optimism is required of anyone who hopes to be a survivor, and finally because there was nowhere else to go. Chapter 12. The door at the head of the stairs opened not into an attic, but instead into a 10-foot square room as featureless and somehow artificial as all those before it, which soon proved to be a kind of shed on the roof. Directly opposite the entrance door waited an exit, through which I stepped onto the flat and parapeted top of the building, closing that last door behind me. Without a window between me and this absolute black sky, the effect of such undetailed heavens was profound, frightening not just because of the uncanny darkness, but also for a reason that eluded me. Or perhaps the reason was not elusive. Maybe I dreaded acknowledging and considering it, for fear that contemplation would soon sweep me out of the main currents of sanity into a tributary of madness. Indeed, the roof was a lunatic place, disorienting under a moonless and starless vault that seemed at first to be an eternal void, but the next moment might have been the low ceiling of a cavern deep in Earth's crust, and then again a void. In spite of the distant lakes of fire, if they were truly fire, the land around this isolated structure lay nearly as dark as the sky above, providing so little ambient light that I could not see as far as any edge of the roof, which in my reality had been guarded by an Art Deco parapet. Even in the remote reaches of the Mojave, even on a night when 2,000 feet of dense ecliptical clouds separated the desert from the glowing wonders of the universe, the land gave off at least a dim light, the product of natural radiation, of minerals in the soil, and of certain vaguely luminous plants. Not here. This outer darkness, so complete, seemed to be capable of a kind of osmosis, gradually penetrating me to blacken my thoughts and eventually extinguish my hope. I could barely see the pale forms of my hands, one fisted, the other clenching the pistol. As I took a two-hand grip on the weapon, it remained all but invisible, and I almost squeezed off a shot just to see the muzzle flash and know that I wasn't going blind. Although I wanted to put more distance between me and the door of the shed, wanted to find something behind which I could hide, chimney stacks, air conditioner housings, anything. My feet seemed to be embedded ankle-deep in long-settled roof tar. But my inability to move was entirely psychological, the blackness above pressing down like deep strata of soil and rock, squeezing upon me from all sides until it seemed that fate, in league with nature, intended that I should become nothing more than a brittle fossil in a thick vein of anthracite. With effort, I shuffled backward a step, another and another, but then halted as a dizziness overcame me, and I began to think that I must be turning as I retreated, gradually arcing away from the roof shed, where the man from the wasteland might at any moment appear. I needed to keep the pistol trained upon that door, because if the stranger came through it with the obvious intent to attack, he would be backlighted only briefly. I would have but a second to discern his intent, and another second to squeeze off a shot before the door fell shut. When he was no longer silhouetted by the lighted shed, I might discover that he could see in the lightlessness of this wretched reality, as well as I was able to see in the full sun of the day. He could then stalk me at his leisure, while in a growing panic, I shot at phantoms until I expended all 10 rounds in the pistol's magazine. Although I am an optimist, my imagination can conjure countless deadly hands from any shuffled deck before the cards are dealt. I am therefore perplexed by so many people who, whether they're optimists or pessimists, trust any dealer as long as he claims to share their vision of how all things ought to be, who trust their own vision to the extent that they never question it, and who believe that 4 of a kind and royal flushes always fall by chance in a world without meaning. To such folks, Hitler was a distant and half-comic figure, until he wasn't, and mad mullahs promising to use nuclear weapons as soon as they obtain them are likewise harmless, until they aren't. I, on the other hand, believe life has profound meaning, and that the meaning of creation itself is benign. But I also know that there are such things as card mechanics who can manipulate any deck to their great advantage. In life, little happens by chance, and most bad hands we're dealt are the consequence of our actions, which are shaped by our wisdom and our ignorance. In my experience, survival depends on hoping for the best, while recognizing that disaster is more likely and that it can't be averted if it can't be imagined. The roof shed door opened. The man out of the wasteland appeared with the jaundiced yellow light behind him, a silhouette of which I could see no details whatsoever. Standing 5'10" or 5'11", he seemed to have an athletic physique, though he wasn't the hulking Terminator or the sinuous shapeshifter that I might have feared. As far as I could tell, he held no weapon. No light from the stairs managed to leak out onto the roof, as if some magical barrier contained it, and I couldn't know whether or not he saw me, but he didn't slip quickly out of the shed and dodge to one side. He paused in the doorway instead, blocking the door with his body, giving me plenty of time to kill him. His confidence seemed to suggest that he didn't bear me any ill will, and therefore assumed I would not harm him, that he was merely curious about me and anticipated nothing more than curiosity in return. The longer he dared to stand there, however, the more his confidence seemed to be a troubling boldness, even effrontery. His continued silence made little sense if his sole reason for pursuing me was mere curiosity. Moment by moment, I found his attitude more arrogant and threatening. Unless his vision was cat-clear in the dark, he could not know that I held a pistol. He might be convinced to explain himself if he was made aware that, at a distance of perhaps 15 feet, I could blow him out of this hostile world into another. Intuition told me not to speak a word. His stillness might be a taunt, inviting me to ask who he was and what he intended. If he wanted me to speak first, then my doing so would in some way surely disadvantage me. As much as it is anything else, my life is a series of pursuits and confrontations. Suddenly I realized that when this man appeared and came after me, I fell into my usual habits and routines, allowing the strangeness of this dark world to recede from my awareness, as if I were grateful to escape into the familiar game of cat and mouse. As a result, giving myself to action, I'd failed to consider that the issues and ideas and needs motivating this man might be as different from my desires and motives as his world was different from mine. Whatever his hesitation in the doorway might imply, whatever his silence was meant to convey, my interpretation of his behavior would most likely be wrong. I was in new territory in every sense of the word, standing waist deep in the surging waters of the unknown, which is the worst place to find oneself, for that riverbed is treacherous underfoot, and those currents are as unpredictable as they are deadly. Intuition and reason told me to remain mute and to be prepared that when he spoke, if he spoke, what little I thought I knew about this place and this man would be washed away, and then events would rush forward in waves and drowning cataracts. My expectation was fulfilled a moment later when the silhouette declared, "My name is Odd Thomas. I see the spirits of the lingering dead." His voice was mine. He stepped forward and the door swung shut behind him, sweeping away the dirty yellow light in the stairwell. Chapter 13. There can be no more dreamlike moment than to encounter yourself in a dark place and to know in your marrow as surely as in your mind that only one of you will leave this rendezvous alive. Yet this was not a dream. In the worst nightmares, the threshold of terror is reached, at which your pounding heart achieves a pace that would set off a cardiac monitor alarm if you were in an ER. Hyperventilation and elevated blood pressure lead to an attack of pulmonary hypertension, and you are violently ejected from sleep, heart hammering so loud that your eardrums seem about to split from the concussions, chest aching, unable to draw an adequate breath. For a moment you are convinced that the malevolent presence from the nightmare, whatever its nature, is still upon you, smothering you. But within seconds, the familiarity of the waking world is an antidote for your panic. As the man who claimed to be me approached, and as the door fell shut behind him, leaving us in an abysmal dark, my heart achieved the requisite pace to trigger an alarm. My breathing became so fast and shallow that a pain rose in my breast, but I did not wake because I was not sleeping. Intuition urgently insisted that I move quickly to my right and squeeze off 3 spread shots at where the other Odd Thomas would be if he continued on a straight line toward my original position. I regret to say that I allowed my intuition to be overruled by instinct, which urged me to shoot now, this instant, shoot or run, but which simultaneously raised in me an existential horror of shooting someone who claimed to be me and who sounded exactly like me. In human beings, low superstition is inevitably entwined with instinct, one struggling for dominance over the other in moments of high risk, a linkage that no doubt dates to our caveman days. And so fright shivered through muscle, sinew, and blood, a dread that if I killed this other, I would at the same time kill myself. Instinct is an animal faculty, independent of instruction and reasoning, but far inferior to intuition, which is a grace unique to humanity. Instinct will never mislead a deer that senses a hunter in the woods and bolts for the cover of a thicker stand of trees, because animals are not subject to superstition that can pollute pure instinct as we are. Besides, instinct always triggers instant action, the fight or flight impulse. But because modern human beings are accustomed to the comforts of Starbucks and smartphones, and aerosol cheese and athletic shoes with air cushion insoles. We rarely find ourselves in crises that can be resolved as easily as choosing to run or attack, other than in the competitive crowds at an electronics store on the first bargain price shopping day after Thanksgiving. Intuition, on the other hand, arises from the perpetual calm in the core of the soul, and it requires of us discrimination and adroitness if it is to serve us well. During that blackout on the roof, I was no more discriminating and adroit than a night-grazing rabbit, abruptly paralyzed by a double flash of lightning and a hammer strike of thunder loud enough to cleave stone. The other had spoken in my voice, therefore I was him and he was me, and to shoot seemed to be suicide. In my defense, I was stupidly immobilized, only for a moment, but that proved long enough for him to seize me by the throat with both hands. His touch was cold, his grip tight. Even at less than arm's length, I couldn't discern the barest outlines of his face. If I had been able to see him, to stare into my own face sans mirror, perhaps I would have been further inhibited, but blindness allowed me to squeeze the trigger, and I pumped 2 rounds into his chest at point-blank range. The hard reports echoed through the darkness, not only out across the vast wasteland, but off something overhead, as though the sky might in fact be plated over with a material more substantial than clouds. Unfortunately, 2 hollow .9mm slugs seemed to have less effect on him than flea bites. His left hand continued to clutch my throat as if his fingers were the steel digits of a robot. But now he clasped the back of my head with his right hand and pulled my face closer to his. I fired again, and twice again, but 4 bullets had no greater effect than 2. Even if he had been wearing a Kevlar vest, the impact of the rounds would have been like fist blows, staggering him if not dropping him to his knees. He pulled me closer and he seemed to be whispering something, but the gunfire had left me temporarily half deaf, and I couldn't understand what he was saying. Although he wasn't choking me, just holding fast to my throat, I inhaled no less violently than a man trapped in a submerged car as he hungrily sought the last air in the bubble near the ceiling. Relinquishing my double grip on the pistol, I felt for his face and found his chin, which I tried to force upward with the heel of my left hand. With my right, I thrust the business end of the weapon against his exposed throat. Because my arm was trapped between us and my elbow jammed firmly against my abdomen, the recoil was absorbed so that the muzzle didn't jump off target, and I emptied the magazine of the last 4 rounds. Even though the first 6 shots had had no effect, I steeled myself for gouting blood, a spray of flesh and bone and brains, but these last 4 rounds were likewise ineffective, as if the pistol had been loaded with blanks. I dropped the gun, or it was wrenched out of my hand, and we were at each other in what should have been evenly matched combat, but he was stronger, uncannily strong. Only a spirit could be impervious to 10 bullets, but no spirit could harm me except by going poltergeist, not with its hands, only with inanimate objects hurled in raptures of rage with streams of spiritual power drawn from a malignant well. With one hand against the back of my head, the other on my throat, unfazed by my punches, he succeeded in drawing me closer until our foreheads knocked together. Still, I was unable to see anything of the other in this father of all darknesses. His lips were close to mine, but I couldn't feel the barest exhalation issue with his words when he said urgently, roughly, "I need your breath." Clutching his throat with both hands, I tried to strangle him while he seemed to want to force me into an unholy kiss. I found the muscles of his throat flaccid, soft, disgusting, as though in spite of his great strength, no life existed in him. The tissues of his neck compressed under my throttling hands, but I couldn't choke him, as if he had no breath that could be denied him, no blood in his carotid arteries that might be withheld from his brain. And yet he was strong, insistent, an immovable object, and at the same time an irresistible force. "Your breath, Piglet," he demanded in a wolfish snarl. "Your breath." His flesh felt more gelid, Gelid, than that of a room-temperature corpse before the heat of decomposition begins to warm it again. Chill and clammy and reminiscent of a fish pulled from a cold lake. I felt in the presence of something unclean, although no smell whatsoever rose from him, neither pleasant nor offensive, which further suggested that what animated him was not life as we think of it. As he chanted, "Your breath," I somehow knew that I still must not speak, that to say anything would be to concede that he might be worthy of my curses, and in so acknowledging him I would give him some crucial advantage in our struggle, which was growing more desperate by the minute. His voice was mine, but sinister, suited to the pitch darkness enveloping us, a voice from the endless night of the endless night. He was so close to administering the kiss of death that, although I could not feel his exhalations, his words vibrated faintly against my lips. "Give me your breath, Piglet, your breath, and the sweet fruit at the end of it." I couldn't shove him away, couldn't pull away, couldn't wound or stagger him. He was as deadly as a tar pit, quicksand personified, and he would draw the life from me as greedily as a henhouse fox draining yolk and egg white out of a bitten shell. Abruptly, gray light from a storm sky dispelled the darkness, and with the reappearance of the filtered sun fell cool rain in torrents, thousands of silvery droplets performing a fairy dance across the roof. The other had vanished. The resurrected city of my reality lay round about, blurred by the downpour. The parapet again marked the perimeter of the building. Evidently, I didn't need to be within the envelope of the structure to be returned here, only in contact with it, and it seemed that while I could move between worlds, albeit involuntarily, the other odd Thomas, whatever it had been, could not, a creature solely of that wasteland. Although I have a competent command of language, I cannot string together a beadwork of words sufficient to express the gratitude I felt for being brought out of that dark land into this world of light and hope, this manifest yet mystical world of ours, where sorrowful mysteries are outnumbered 2-to-1 by those that are joyful and glorious. Trembling violently, I sank to my knees. In disgust with one hand and then with the other, I scrubbed my lips, although the thing that would have kissed away my life, and more than my life, had not quite been able to do so. I didn't mind being soaked to the skin and chilled, because the rain washed from me the feeling that I was unclean where the other had touched me. With relief, but also with some apprehension that the blinding dark might again depose the daylight, I recovered the drop pistol, crossed the roof to the shed, and opened the door. The interior of the shed was not as clean and featureless as it had been when I first ascended to it in that other realm. Enough stormlight found its way inside to reveal abandoned spiderworks tattering in the corners of the ceiling, a generous layer of dust on the shelves, and a litter of paper scraps and broken glass across the floor. On the shelf stood a few oddly shaped cans, so old and rusted that their labels could not be read. The air was redolent of wood rot and a lacquer-like smell that came from something that for weeks or months had been oozing from one of the rusty containers. I realized that in the otherworld version of this building, there had been no odors, either foul or sweet, just as there had been no sounds except those that I made. When I opened the creaking door at the head of the single flight of narrow stairs, I smelled mold and dust. The shaft was dark except for watery light below, where the lower door hung open and askew on 2 of 3 hinges. In the third-floor hallway, I discovered the source of that vague illumination: 3 skylights. The hollow rataplan, R-A-T-A-P-L-A-N, of rain on the slanted panes unnerved me because it masked other sounds that I might need to hear, and I hurried to the west stairwell. By the time that I made my way down to the garage on the ground floor of this crumbling structure, I reached the conclusion that the other version of the building, the one without dust or odors or fine details, was not a part of the black wasteland with the distant lakes of fire. It possessed a character different from both this world and that one, as though it must be in some kind of borderland between realities, sort of way station. The garage contained no vehicle. The white van once stored there had been driven away earlier by the would-be burner of children, or perhaps by his hard-faced, stocky friend in the black leather jacket. The fancy ProStar Plus was secreted in the other garage, the one in the Borderland building, to be retrieved when its owner had need of it. Evidently, the Rhinestone Cowboy not only knew of these way stations, but also seemed able, unlike me, to come and go from them at will. I tucked the pistol in my waistband, under my sodden sweatshirt, glanced at the high latticed windows to be sure that the lightless wasteland had not again closed around the building, and left by the man-sized door. I stepped into the storms, the one that is merely weather, and the other that is the story of humanity.